Hi guys, this is Dr. Sadashivam once again with you. Imagine an organizational development intervention exercise, and the location is deep into the depths of the Pacific Ocean. And this particular experiment, it was not by design but by accident. I'm talking about Captain David Marquet, one of the war veterans of the United States Navy. He was the one who was credited with giving totally a new theory to the management literature, and that was intent-based leadership, one of the best leadership theories, and it was put into practice and it was highly successful. In fact, he was credited with this rare privilege, with this rare feat of bringing up one of the submarines from the last of the fleet to the number one in the fleet. We are talking about the nuclear submarine USS Santa Fe. Now, if you look at this submarine, it was the same crew, the same officers, and the same war machine. But how come it was lost in the fleet? And what was done as an organizational intervention exercise that brought it to the first in the list of ships in the fleet? As anyone can imagine, it was nothing but leadership, leadership, and leadership. In fact, he was the one who was responsible for transforming the submarine culture from permission-based leadership to intent-based leadership. Typically, permission-based leadership is there's one person who is the captain of the ship, you have general managers in the corporates, you have one person who will give all the orders, and everyone in the pecking order, they all become doers. Everybody seeks the permission of their bosses, and that is how the pecking order works. And that's how corporates, your military, your defense forces, they've all been working. But he was the one who brought in a totally new paradigm to leadership. And we are going to talk about that leadership, and that's what he calls as intent-based leadership. Beautiful theory to watch out, and we are going to talk a lot about that. Of course, in the management literature, in MBA's Master of Business Administration, we have talked about lots and lots of management gurus, starting with your Henry Fayol, your Frederick Taylor, a lot of people, your Vroom motivation theory of needs by Maslow, Hertzberg theories, and most of these people like Stephen Covey, especially if you talk about the modern day management philosophy. You have Brian Tracy, you have Ron Kaufman, you have Stephen Covey, and a whole lot of such people, Napoleon Hill, etc., who are all considered as management gurus. But this intent-based leadership that we are talking about, Captain had implemented in his own submarines, and the results speak for themselves, and we've got lots and lots of interesting anecdotes. Okay, he's written a book called as Turn That Ship Around, which is a beautiful book, a super book. But I will try to give you some excerpts of what that book says, and so that you all can go through the book completely to understand the spirit of what Captain really wants to convey to all of you, especially on this subject of leadership. Okay. Now, before we talk about the subject, we will talk about submarines a little bit. Okay. Typically, we all know that submarine stays under the water. It has got a captain, and it's got around 7 to 10 officers and a crew of 150 men. We all know that there is not much of room in a submarine because most of the space is occupied by equipment. Okay, so that's the true nature of a submarine, and it's a lethal weapon, a war weapon, very, very lethal in nature, right? So if you look at the training, these officers are important, especially during the initial stages in National Defense Academy or the Indian Military Academy, the Naval Academy at Erimala, etc., INS Venduruthi, etc. Everybody is taught to do what they are told. I'm talking about officers, right? They have to do what they are told to. Whether we are not just talking about the Indian academies, we are talking about Sandhurst, we are talking about United Kingdom academies, your United States naval academies. In all these naval academies, remember Officers and Gentlemen movie. Officers are trained one thing, which is you are supposed to do what you are told. Where does that stem from? In the words of David Marquet himself, he talks about the Industrial Revolution. So typically when you talk about the Industrial Revolution, we are talking about mass production. When you talk about mass production, I think Ford company, which started manufacturing cars, they made a lot of cars during the beginning of the 20th century, somewhere in 2000, 2005, 1905, etc., etc. Remember this famous adage of Henry Ford, who said that I will produce any car as long as it's black. Okay, exactly the same mass production we are talking about it. Everybody does what they are told to you. The manager will tell them, and these guys are supposed to carry out what his manager says, right? And Navy, Defense Forces, any of these is not an exception. Most organizations function like that. It's like I think it was one movie, I think October Revolution or something. It's a early 90s movie, Hunt for October Revolution, I guess. The captain of the ship says, do what I tell you to do, or I will charge you with mutiny, right? Very famous quote, right? Now, if you talk about Captain David Marquet, he completely transforms the culture in that submarine. In his view, intentions reign supreme. Everybody in the ship agree that 150 crewmen, including the officers, each one needs to take pride in their respective job. Each one of them need to have a feeling that everyone is working for a collective purpose, a higher purpose, and in this case defending the country's borders, right? And in fact, he very strongly feels that instead of taking control of the submarine, the best way of taking control of the submarine is to give control to people. That was what his basic philosophy. And he transformed the culture of that submarine from a one man, that is the captain commanding, and a crew of 150 people and officers doing, and he changes that culture to what? He changed that culture to 150 thinking people, including the officers. In fact, he created a culture that builds creativity. Everybody works for a collective purpose. He insisted that this should be the feeling in everybody's mind when they go down the hatchet every day. We're talking about is not a fiction, but it's a real life story of Captain David Marquet. He's now an international corporate trainer, and he's been facilitating a number of such workshops in more than 50 countries around the globe on leadership. And he's the author of that book, Turn That Ship Around, about which I talked about sometime, about one of the finest books on leadership, right? So as far as this particular story goes, he had an aspiration to become a naval captain, a nuclear submarine captain. He was trained for around 12 months to take over the command of a submarine called as USS Olympiad. And this submarine was berthed in the Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in the United States, and he was supposed to take over captaincy of that particular submarine. So normally what happens is, before he takes over that, he's trained for attached to the captain of that ship. And over a period of time they need to familiarize about that submarine controls, etc., etc. So over a period of time he became an expert on every piece of gear in that submarine. For example, the internals of the pumps, the electrical diagram, the missile tubes, the sonar room controls, the engine room, the ballasts, etc., etc. In fact, if there was a one person in the planet who knew everything about that submarine, it was Captain David Marquet. In fact, in one of his books, he also says that he was able to identify the breakers of the submarine even in the dark, and that much was his familiarity as far as this submarine was concerned. USS Olympiad, and not just the machines. You got to work with people, right? So as regards the crew, he connected himself very well with the crew people. Okay, he was a very passionate person, because being a captain of a nuclear submarine was his aspiration for a very long time, and this was a dream coming true, and that was the passion with which he took control of that submarine. And he connected very well with the complete crew, their education, they are married, not married, their children, relatives, their girlfriends, if they are bachelors, their hobbies, etc., etc. So that much was his familiarity with the people, much like his familiarity with the various gears in that submarine. And now there was another submarine which was berthed right next to that, in the same Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, right near the USS Olympiad, and that submarine was USS Santa Fe. He talks a lot about US Santa Fe in his book. I request you to go through that book to understand the story completely, right, through his own words. Let me talk a little bit about the submarine. The submarine Santa Fe had a very dubious reputation. It had one of the worst retention rates, and it was lost in the fleet. And out of the 150 crew members, only 3 people opted for re-enlistment, because everybody wanted to move away. In his own words, the USS Santa Fe was called the Enron of the submarines, in his own words. Every piece of gear in that submarine had issues. It will set out to sail, but it will come back in a day or two. Some issue or the other, the pump bearing breaking down, the water leaking from the hatchet, the reactor developing only 40% of the power, etc., etc. In fact, these guys used to call those guys in US Santa Fe as poor fellows. And the day of reckoning came. The captain of Santa Fe opted for premature retirement, 12 months, much before his tenure of retirement. And then what happened? The Navy was looking for a suitable captain, and they selected Captain David Marquet. He was appointed as a new captain of that submarine. So someone he was really making fun of, now the time has come that he has to take over captaincy of that submarine, karma. In his own words, he says his life was already over. He also explains he didn't like that, not because of its poor retention rate, not because of its performance, but because it was totally a different kind of submarine. It is a new submarine, but he explains its sail plants were different, its power plants were different, its missile tubes were different, the reactor was completely different, the ballast tanks, trim track, the hydroplanes, the conning tower, everything was different. It's the mating hatch configurations, etc., etc. The whole submarine will have problem. In fact, every piece of gear in that submarine was completely different. He was thinking it was quite a scary situation. Obviously, we are not talking about a toy or a car that you want to take for a spin in the evening. It's a submarine. It's a war machine, right? But then life has to move on. He took command of that ship. Put on his uniform, and he was ready to move inside the ship. He was a positive person, all said and done. And the whole book talks about his experience. How did he enter the ship? What kind of organizational development interventions he did? How did he bring in that culture of accountability, that culture of responsibility in that submarine? In fact, he explains during one of his daily visits to the sonar room. He talked about his experience. Very interesting experience. Okay, if you go through that book, I'm unable to encapsulate all that into the small 10-15 minutes video. He talks about this sonar room experience. He explains what a sonar room is. Most of us working in the corporate industry, we don't know what a sonar room is, right? And he explains that because the sonar room in a submarine is a place which captures all the sounds in the ocean. And these sounds are converted into some kind of, lines, and the outputs is fed into some kind of a data analytics machine or something like that. These are called as squiggly green lines in the submarine parlance. And from the frequency, they will be able to figure out whether it is a torpedo from an enemy ship, or it is a cruise ship, or is it a school of fish, or an oil tanker, etc., etc. Or is it an enemy submarine, right? They will be able to, figure out all that. That's what a sonar room does. In fact, one of the movies, I don't remember, I think it was the same October Revolution movie, where there was a specific scene in which the guy says, he hears the frequency of the torpedo, and he says, this is a torpedo from the Alpha class Russian submarine, right? The frequency, the Doppler's effect we have studied in physics. From that frequency, he was able to find out which class, Alpha class, or is a Ohio class, or a Vanguard class, or a Papa class, Scorpion class. You have various such class of submarine. They will be able to find out from the frequency. But as far as the submarine we are talking about, USS Santa Fe, every piece of gear in that submarine was different. It was all Greek and Latin for Captain David Marquet. So in one instance, he goes to the sonar room. He asks one of the sailor, what is this? What is the switch? What is this control? He was able to explain some of those switches. But the sailor was avoiding a specific switch. Being a captain, he could figure out that the sailor was not moving towards that particular switch. He was consciously avoiding. He says, sailor, tell me what this switch is. What is this? The guy says, thinks for some time, and he says, I don't know. And probably people at lower levels, they have lots of excuse. I wasn't trained. My instructor did not, teach this, etc., etc. Their expectation is captain is the know-all of the ship. They all expected that the captain will teach him what it is, right? He cracked a joke, He says, can we press it and see what happens? The captain asks the sailor. That was a great joke, What if we attack a Carnival cruise ship, right? It happened, by the way, once it happened. Right? In his philosophy says, if you do not know the answer, the leader needs to have the courage of saying that he doesn't know the answer, so that everyone in the organization says, I don't know. This culture of learning permeates throughout the organization. That is very important, because when the leader of the ship says that he doesn't know specific things, it becomes that much easier for all the other people to say they don't know. This way, they will be able to learn more. A culture of learning comes in, and everybody starts learning and growing, right? So he talks a lot of such instances in terms of what kind of steps he had taken to bring in that culture of learning in the submarine. Okay, so his only philosophy was to empower people, to make them drill hard, to train hard, learn new things, being creative in their approach, etc., etc., right? So as part of the regular exercises, there was one specific exercise he talks a lot about. He wanted to shut down the nuclear reactor. It was a nuclear submarine, right? So normally the exercise is to shut down that reactor, right? And then operate it on the normal battery and the motor for a limited period of time. And then if there is any repair to be carried out in the reactor, that can be done. Those repairs can be carried out. So these are some of the exercises normally which are done in submarines in order to be combat ready when such situations arise, so that people are not caught unawares. And that is the reason for some of those exercises he wanted to do in that submarine. Now what happens is, when you stop the reactor, before that, let's talk about what a reactor does in a nuclear submarine. The nuclear reactor has thousands and thousands of kilowatts of power, a huge power, right? Ahead, flank, the helmsman says, ahead, flank, high, ting, 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 these sounds come from that, right? The same sound. The throttle in the engine room, that sends a signal to the engine room. Just as if you press the accelerator of your car, the throttle opens and the car starts moving forward. Same thing happens in a submarine. When the throttle opens in the engine room and spins it open, big valves open, and the steam from the reactor goes into the main turbine, okay? And they are like two big Volvo buses standing next to each other, and they drive a 50-foot propeller, making the submarine surge through the depths of the ocean. It's a massive, amazing sight. It's an amazing sight, no doubt. Beautiful sight. Okay. So when you shut down the reactor, what happens? You don't have that much of power. It's like when you shut down the reactor, it's something like a blender motor in the kitchen, like this. The small electric motor, barely, 300 HP motor, pushing a 6,000 ton submarine, right? 6,000 ton submarine. So people were doing that exercise. He narrates that experience in his book. And I just thought I will talk a little bit about that particular instance. Very interesting. You have a reactor and you have approximately some speeds I will try to explain, because we need to understand those speeds. You have 2-3 heads there, head 1/3, head 2/3, and there is full, etc., etc. Normally when the submarines in this kind of a situation, they are run at head 1/3. They go slowly. It will not draw much current from the battery, because if it is not drawing much current from the battery, it gives that much more extra time for the engineers to work on their nuclear pumps, turbines, whatever. But at times we need to stretch our limits, and that is why the captain says, let's now 2/3, let's put some pressure on the crewmen, okay, so that it draws more battery, let's put some pressure. He speaks to the deck officer. The name of the deck officer was Bill Green or something like that. I'm forgetting the name. Bill Green. Hey Nav, speed up, put it on 2/3, put pressure on the team. Let's see how they work under pressure. The navigator says there's no 2/3 in this ship. There is no 2/3. Marquet talks about submarines. All submarines have 2 speeds, but this particular submarine, for whatever reason, it had only 1 speed. He asks, Nav, did you know this? He says, yes, I did. Then why did you order this submarine? The guy says, I was told to. Do what you're told has been the culture, so that he can get the next promotion. He can become the next captain, next commodore, next rear admiral. It talks a lot about how people exactly do what they are told. People stop being creative. People stop being innovative. And what all the captain or the leader needs to do to empower people in their respect. All of that works in corporate companies also. The problem was the captain was the only person in the ship giving orders. So it's not a question of a captain giving a wrong order. The question was, why was the captain the only one giving the orders? He raises this question. And therefore, he says, he stopped giving orders totally. And he feels that this is the only way to unlock the power of human beings. You create an organization where people are executing the things without being told. He talks a lot about people management. He talks about how greatness comes from people making a decision to do something great, and he stopped completely giving orders to the officers. He wanted to bring in this particular culture. So we were talking about, he said, okay, he stopped giving orders completely, because he said everyone needs to say what their intention was. For example, I intend to. He will not seek permission. They will say, I intend to. The officers will say, I intend to. The chief will say, I intend to. The culture of responsibility and accountability started permeating throughout the organization. Everybody talks the same language. He transformed the submarine from a one thinking person to 150 thinking men. And that is what he is talking about. 150 thinking men. He talks about another very important incident, which is inspection at sea inspection. This is called as a at-sea inspection, which typically ranges shooting torpedoes, firing missiles, driving the ship. Remember we were talking about the speeds in the submarine, 2/3 and 1/3 and all that. 1/3. We were talking about that. Those taxes, those things will be done, drawing more power from the battery, putting pressure on the team, etc., etc. All these things will take place during that inspection. Obviously, you cannot draw more power, because sometimes you say ahead, flank, high, etc. The ship goes at a very, very full speed, right? There are certain aggressive maneuvers which are done, when you would like to avoid collision with the other ships. Sometimes you are being range gated by torpedoes from other submarines. You could be shot by any enemy vessels, etc., etc. At such times, these things are used. Generally, they are used very, very rarely, because the ship is not designed to run at that speed for long. Ahead, flank, and high, etc., etc. These are done during emergency situations. But in this particular at-sea inspection we are talking about, people are under a very high state of stress, and each of these exercises are done just to check the combat readiness. Okay, this is just one exercise where he was able to bring in this kind of culture in that submarine, and this was on the last of the fleet. After this inspection, the USS Santa Fe came on the first, one of the best scores, and that was how he was able to change the culture of the whole ship, so that every person in the crew understood his responsibilities, accountabilities, and then worked accordingly. This is intent-based leadership. You cannot order anybody. That's the basic theory. You cannot order anybody to be dedicated and passionate, because this is something that has to come from within. And as a captain, as a leader, as a manager, he has to create that environment. He has to create that conducive environment in the ship. He talks about a very interesting thing, which is about loading a torpedo in some port in Japan. Very interesting thing. Let me talk about loading a torpedo and what it involves. It's a very complex operation which involves a big crane, a cradle. It involves lots and lots of hydraulics, cables, and host of things are involved. It's a very risky operation, and normally it takes around 40 to 50 people to carry out that operation. Normally what happens is, in the naval manuals, you have a standard operating procedure. There is a brief that needs to be done, and it's very religiously being followed. People take out a book on loading torpedoes. They open the book, every single page. He quotes a few words. Upon the signal of the crane operator, thou shalt take a snub turn on the fourth captain inspection. These are some of the verbatim commands, that David Marquet has mentioned in his book, the kind of commands, especially as far as the briefing was concerned. So you have such rituals throughout the ship. Everywhere in the ship, you have such standard operating procedures, right? And once in a while, when these inspectors come, to inspect the ship, they are the ones very happy finding out problems, right? Finding problem was one of the most joyous things for them, because they can make out as many problems, they can send it to Pentagon, and the more number of mistakes they point out, they get that much of credit that he's done a great job. They get commendations, they get promotions. They are inspectors. So in one of these inspections, the inspector goes to the captain. Captain Marquet, we have come for inspecting your submarine, and we would like to see all these operations, and we also want to see how the brief is being done, etc. He said, this guy talks like a guy from Pentagon, right? Okay, anyway, good jokes. According to David Marquet, he says brief was not required. He says what is required was loading the torpedo properly. That was required. He talks about one of the best initiatives he took in that ship, and that was he replaced the word briefing with something called as certification. Beautiful concept it was. Of course, I've worked in a Japanese company, and we call it as Gemba, we call it as quality circles, kaizens, and there are so many ways through which the managers are able to connect with the shop floor workers and getting things done. But it was very pleasing to hear this from a naval commander, the naval captain, and that to a ship captain, talking this kind of Japanese concepts, of course in a different name. He replaced the brief with certification. He says, they generally asked a crew of sailors, guys, my dear sailor, what is your job? What is your role? What kind of decisions will you be taking? To what extent those decisions that you are taking will be impacting this mission? Is there anything you are worried about? Do you think anything could go wrong in this kind of a setup? Guys keep sitting, talking it over, thrashing it over in terms of what can go wrong, etc., etc. They are well prepared. And only when the entire group of 40 people involved in this operation, they are all satisfied to the last I and T, That is when these guys will approach the captain, that is David Marquet, right? In this particular case, and they will say, Captain, we have completed the certification. Now we intend to commence torpedo loading, right? That was the culture, right? Now, sometimes it might happen. People might say they are not ready, right? Sometimes in such cases, what happens? The captain has to take that responsibility, because in the earlier situation when things were not ready, people were embarrassed to say that. But at times when things are not going well, the subordinates, they must be empowered. They need to have the courage to tell the captain, sir, certain things have not been done because of whatever reasons, right? They must have the courage. He is to welcome that. That is how you empower people. And sometimes when they are not ready, he talks about now a new message needs to be sent to the tender. The captain of the tender, in this particular case, he needs to send a message. The captain of the tender who had his ship ready to load the torpedo, right? Whatever reason he can give, we need to get the gear right, or certain problem in the pump, or whatever, the hook, crane. And sometimes it is embarrassing and bad, there is no doubt, to keep the captain of the tender waiting. But it is not as bad as dropping the torpedo into the ocean. He says empowering and delegation is extremely important. But he also talks about the importance of control in the whole thing. Control without two pillars is extremely bad. Empowering delegation is extremely important. This reminds me of Ken Blanchard's situational leadership theory. He talks about 4 levels of leadership: direct, guide certain people, you coach certain people, you delegate to certain people, and that's Ken Blanchard's situational leadership theory. But David Marquet comes little close to that. He says you should do the empowerment, but at the same time, control without these 2 pillars is extremely bad, and that too in a nuclear submarine. And what are the 2 pillars he talks about? He talks about competence and clarity. So typically when you talk about competence, what does that mean? In the context of a nuclear submarine, here competence means the basic knowledge of the laws of physics, that is important. Your basic ability in starting up the reactor, some of the basic commands, functions of a submarine, diversing the shore power, etc., etc. Those are extremely important. Clarity is also extremely important. Their mission, their vision, their overall mindset, etc., etc. That is clarity in terms of what his role is and how important it is to managing the affairs of the submarine and accomplishing the mission they are set out to do. Okay, in his book he also talks about a very, very important thing about pushing authority to information. Normally what happens is he talks about a lot of such naval rituals throughout the ship. For example, a sailor wants to apply for leave, it has to go through 6 people, division chief, and then it goes to the senior chief warshak, and then it goes to the department chief, and then the divisional officer, then the departmental head, and then the executive officer. The executive officer may have the authority, but does he have the information about that particular sailor? That's the question. That is exactly where he wanted to bring in certain rules. He wanted to push authority to information. The person who had the maximum information about that particular sailor in that particular situation and time, in this particular case, the leave application. His division chief and his senior chief warshak, he has all the information about that sailor, right? Who's that guy? Is he a good kid? Where does he want to go? Why does he want to go? All that information. So he wants to empower people at the lowest levels, and these are some of the extremely important things. Okay, so typically what he wants to say is the more you take control, the less gets done. He talks a lot about improvement. He says you don't have to empower everybody, because everybody who is born in this world is born with a certain degree of empowerment. It is just the mindset that makes all the difference. And the job of a captain is to create a conducive environment, a conducive platform within the submarine, in the closed confines of that submarine, that makes them feel empowered, makes them feel important, makes them feel proud about the job they are doing. The captain's job is just to ensure that when people go down the hatchet, they must have a pride of work, right? That is what is extremely important. He says good captains gives good orders. That's a myth. He calls it a myth completely. Good captains giving good orders, bad captains giving bad orders. He says a good captain never gives any order. And that was when he took a vow that he will never give an order, right? The final order, whether to launch a weapon, to launch a missile, that he will keep with him, because that's a moral and ethical responsibility which involves some. He says that is one responsibility I will reserve with myself, but for all the other things he wants to delegate to people, right? He did that in the naval literature. A lot of things that a captain should authorize: submerge the ship, start the reactor, shut the reactor, connect to the shore power, diverse from the shore power. All these requires the captain's authorization, right? If you want to make your people think, do not give people instruction, but give them intent. That's what he says. That's intent-based leadership we are talking about, It's not, but our captain not steady course, flank, high. That's not a captain's job, right? He talks about, is there enemy submarine in the vicinity? Where should we position the ship? He asked this question to his man. He used to ask these kind of questions to his commander. The sailors and commanders used to say, sir, so here, this latitude, this longitude. Then he will say, go ahead. Of course, little bit of exaggeration might have been there. He's become a corporate trainer, so just to boost up the morale, he might give some stories. But get the spirit of what he wants to say. He talks about empowering people. He's empowered all of them. They don't have to seek permission from him for small things. Empowerment. There is no business of submerge the ship. These are some of the commands, right? So he feels that small nuanced change of language has brought in a great level of psychological honors to every single person down the line, right from the commanders, lieutenant commanders. The whole responsibility and accountability shifts from the captain to the people under him. So it becomes kind of a shared responsibility. Sometimes, this brings enormous. Sometimes he will ask his commander, what do you think the captain is thinking? The commander will answer that question. The master chief, they will all answer that question. Sir, what we think you're thinking right now is you're thinking all men are below, all hatches are shut. Is the vessel rigged for a dive, bottom depth? Are we in the right water? Is this the water rightly assigned to us? Etc. etc. He will say, yes, exactly, that is on my mind. So what are you saying? What are you saying? They will say, yes, it's been taken care of. Then he will give the final order. Right? He talks a lot about giving control to people, like in most places where there is one man thinking, one thinking man who will be the captain, and a crew of 150 people who are just taking the orders. He transforms the whole culture. He develops a culture of 150 thinking, acting, passionate, proactive people, moving the authority from authority to information. They have the information, their feet are on the street, they know what is best for the ship, and they can act faster, they can take faster decisions. That's the culture he wants to bring, and that is when every person in the crew starts thinking those people really feel they matter in the whole gamut of things. And the job of the captain is just to create that environment. It is not about taking control and attracting followers. It is more about giving control to them and creating leaders. And this is what is the gist of his whole book. And he brings in his wealth of experience and Captain David Marquet's life experience as the captain of a nuclear submarine. I hope you liked this video, and I request each one of you to buy that book, go through that book and read that book. It's a beautiful book on leadership, and it provides all important elements of leadership. And thank you very much. And this is Dr. Sadashivam signing up till we meet again in the next episode. Jai Hind. Bye-bye.